1. So about 7 or 8 months ago, I worked for a private contractor, mostly just grunt work. Carry this, destroy that, etc. Every now and again, I would get a specific job. Well, on this occasion, I had to install a vapor barrier and insulation in a crawl space. The tight dirt floor space with a lot of pipes that's under your house. So I put my cheap crawl space suit on that's already ripping as I kneel down to soldier crawl under the house. I grab a flashlight and the rolls of plastic sheets. I'm rolling the vapor barrier out and staking it down as I go. As I'm pushing the stake into the dirt, I felt something run across my hand. I just about Kool-Aid manned right through the floor above me, but of course I didn't. I grabbed my flashlight and started looking around. And in between just about every floor joist, I can see dozens if not hundreds of eyes reflecting light back to me. I look directly above my head, and there's like 3 tablespoon-sized spiders staring right into my soul. I suppress the second wave of panic and try to calmly make my way out of the crawl space. And I can't help but notice every pair of eyes on me as I'm leaving. After my successful noping out, I called my boss and told him what was up. He told me something along the lines of, "They're more scared of you. You're like 1,000 times their size." And after a good 5 minutes of calling me a pussy, he says, "The faster you get it done, the faster you can get out." So, I, the naive youngin' I was, decided he was right, and what could they possibly do to me? Anyway, I'm sure you can see where this is going. I managed to get the vapor barrier down without a problem, other than the permanent and immense feeling of dread and impending doom. But as I was stuffing the insulation in between the floor joists where the critters were hanging out, I felt a blunt sting on the back of my hand. I immediately knew what it was. I crawled out again, called my boss again, and after another 5-minute phone, I headed back in. Again. Also on the phone call, he told me I had to head to another house and prep the living room to be painted. Then I could go home. I was back inside the crawl space, absolutely hating my career choice at the moment. But I finished the crawl space, drove 10 minutes and prepped the living room. I drove the work van back to his house, got in my car, and decided I was too tired to sit in a waiting room for hours on end. I know how stupid that was, but went home, showered vigorously, and went to bed. When I woke up in the morning, my hand was a little swollen, but nothing to be concerned about. I went to work and got sent to a house in the middle of nowhere to load 6x6 posts into a trailer to be used at another job site. Almost as soon as I started to work and sweat, my hand started to ache and then burn and then eventually, blissfully, went numb. I didn't bother calling my boss, I just texted him. "I need to go to the hospital." I got a call about 20 minutes later as I'm pulling my car out of his driveway. I'll save you his 35-minute tangent. In conclusion, he said, "If you're not feeling well, then don't come in, because right now you're wasting my time, and I'm not paying you for an hour and 15 minutes worth of work. Be at my house tomorrow, 6 a.m., ready to work the whole day." And that, folks, was fucking it. I called off the next 3 days due to my hand. I could have worked after the first day I left early. The antibiotics and ointment the doctors prescribed me worked wonderfully. But why should I have to if I wasn't feeling 100%? Anyway, I started looking for a job the same day I left the hospital. After that, I called out for everything from back pain to a fucking hangnail. I only lasted a month and a half after this, but in that month I called off at least 15 times. The only notice being a text message that he would see when he first wakes up. Normally, it wouldn't have been a big deal having one employee calling out ritualistically, but I was the only person working for him at the time that could or would drive the van that had all his tools and equipment in it. So the days I called out, he had to leave his shiny black diesel-lifted Ford F-250 at home, and he would have to drive the work van. Honestly, I was trying to get fired at that point, and I love saying, "Sorry, boss, I just didn't want to waste your time." A few things I should mention. The job was under the table, and that's why I didn't get fired immediately for attendance, and why my boss was able to just not pay me. After looking at a few different spiders on the internet, I think the ones in the crawl space were wolf spiders. I'm not positive, but they look pretty similar. Oh, and in case it wasn't clear, there must have been upwards of 200 spiders in the crawl space. I wasn't much of an arachnophobe beforehand, but after that, I can't even think about a spider without getting chills. And what I can only describe as a war flashback. 2. I live in a country where the real estate agents do no work. They post an apartment on one of the real estate sites, and you need to chase them to see the listing at the precise time that they choose. I found an apartment that seemed okay, messaged the real estate agent on WhatsApp, to which he responds, "Call me." A little short, but no big deal. I give him a call, and again he is very brusque on the phone, telling me that I must be on time as he is a very busy man. Okay, again no big deal. The appointment is for 6 p.m, and I got stuck in a meeting but still expected to be on time, but just in case, I texted him saying I would be 5 minutes late. I show up at exactly 6:01 p.m. and see that he isn't even waiting for me. He was in his real estate office on the ground floor of the building complex that I am seeing the apartment. He's in his office doing work, and I walk into his office, say hi, and he immediately starts complaining that I'm late. I apologize and say I'm here, but a friend, a local who is fluent in the local language, is going to be here very shortly to see the apartment with me. I call my friend, and he says he is 2 minutes away, to which the real estate agent tells me that he has another appointment, and that he will have to make us wait until after the next appointment. I responded that my friend will be here very shortly, and to please wait a little bit until he arrives. He responds that he makes sure all of his appointments are very organized, and that he does not like having multiple people at the same time. I tell him I do not mind having someone else with me, and can ask the group if they do not mind seeing the apartment with me. He ignores this comment and keeps working. My friend then shows up at exactly 6:05 p.m. I know because I check my clock. My friend walks in, says hi, and the agent then takes his time getting up and locking his office, so we can go upstairs to see the apartment. We walk to the 3rd floor, knock on the door, and the tenant lets us in. I start walking around and start chatting with the current tenant and his partner. The real estate agent says, "Don't talk to the tenant, look at the apartment." I continue walking around, see most of the apartment, and then continue chatting with the tenant and begin asking a few questions about the apartment. I ask how is the noise in the apartment. The real estate agent immediately interrupts and says not to talk to the tenant. I ask the real estate agent why, and he ignores me. The tenant begins responding to the question and ignores him, telling me the apartment has practically no noise. Great. Next question is how is the landlord? The real estate agent again interrupts, saying very loudly, "What did you say?" I repeat my question to him, and he says not to ask about the landlord, but continue looking at the apartment. The tenant begins responding that the landlord is fine, but the real estate agent again interrupts for us not to talk. I thought, okay, maybe the agent is stressed that the next appointment is coming, and say, "Okay, can I have the tenant's number so we can talk afterwards?" I appreciate that this is taboo to real estate agents, but speaking to the tenant is a must in my book, and if we can't speak now, then why not speak later? I had no intent of going around the real estate agent. He loses it. He starts aggressively telling me to get out. Cue malicious compliance. You want me out? Fine. I go outside and wait on the front steps of the building and notice it is now 6:41, which is likely close to when he scheduled his next appointment. I see a couple approach the building and approach them and ask if they're here to see the apartment. They say yes, and I proceed to tell them to be careful of the apartment and the landlord, as something is very wrong with it if the real estate agent does not want me talking with the current tenant. The real estate agent starts yelling at me and threatening to call the cops. I ignore him until I complete the story to the new couple, to which they thank me and go inside with him. We're not done yet. Still outside, my friend sees someone new entering the building. He approaches the new guy, quickly tells him what just happened. The new guy responds that yes, the real estate agent is awful, and he would be happy to give the number of his landlord. I call his landlord, explain the situation, to which he responds he is sorry this occurred, and would be happy to give me the number of the actual apartment owner. I call up the actual owner and tell the story. The owner apologizes that it happened, said that she would talk to the real estate agent and see what can be done, and that his behavior was not okay. 3. This one stems from 10 years ago. Back then, I was called upon to sit in as a bass player on a recording session for a Merseybeat-influenced song for a singer-songwriter who was still forming a touring band. The SSW had a certain sound in mind, which needed a really fat vintage bass tone that was used in the 60s, and I happened to have the right tool for the job, a Gibson EB2 from the mid-1960s. So I got a call since the SSW heard I had that bass and asked if he could loan it, or even better, if I wanted to play on the session. It was easy money with no further obligations, so I agreed. I arrived at the session with my base and cheat sheet, and noticed everything was already installed, so it was plug and play. Nowadays, a bass line is recorded as a double track. The signal from the instrument is split, one line going straight into the mixing console, and the other is going through an amplifier that has a microphone. Both signals are blended, so you have articulation from the direct line and character from the mic'd signal. So I took my bass, tuned it, silently, with a clip-on tuner. Plugged it straight in the amp, twiddling the knobs to get a fairly neutral sound, making sure I first put the master volume at 0 and then slowly up. Meanwhile, the recording engineer that day tossed me an extra cable and junction box that I needed to place between my bass and the amplifier, so he could run the signal straight in the table. The RE had a bit of a pretentious air surrounding him, pretending to know it all, better, and bossing the musicians around, belittling them at the same time. He took a look at my bass, rolled his eyes, and said that a modern music man would be better suited, and was more versatile, instead of that old hag and probably sounded like a turd. The Old Hag, Gibson EB2, was a very popular bass back in the 1960s, but nowadays it has faded into obscurity. It's a one-trick pony, but it absolutely excels at its sole trick, producing absolutely gargantuan levels of low-end frequency. Don't expect any clarity, articulation, or finesse from it. It sounds like a wet fart coming from the anus of Satan himself. On top of that, it has an extremely high signal output, dwarfing even the output of active instruments with onboard amplifiers. The pickup responsible for all that has earned a nickname of its own, the Mudbucker, because all it does is producing mud. Back in the days, those Gibson EB basses had a reputation of being able, with normal use, to fry any loudspeaker within minutes just by their sheer power, the sole exception being the Ampeg Portaflex amps, which were built like a tank. So I was ready, and the RE, who since had retreated to the control room, told me to play something to get the levels right, via the talkback, a mic used to be able to speak with the control room. I told him that I already adjusted the amp to my liking, but that I advised him to turn the volume of the direct line to 0 on his side and slide it up slowly. I was rather rudely interrupted that he knew what he was doing, and that I just needed to pluck a string, so we could get on. So that's what I did. I plucked a string. At that very moment I saw his eyes basically pop out of his sockets, and him frantically mash a button on the mixing console. I don't know what happened on the other side of that window, but I'm fairly sure that the EB2 claimed the life of 2 rather expensive studio speakers, the cones being blasted, or at least having to produce one hell of a distorted and overridden signal that they were not designed for. The session itself was nothing special. 1 playthrough as a rehearsal, 4 takes, and it was a wrap. I didn't stick around for the playback, but I heard via the singer-songwriter that he had to initially listen to the track via headphones, and not via the speakers in the control room. I received a final mix a few weeks later, but he decided to shelve the song, with it not really fitting the rest of his material. The Gibson got sold a few years later, as it was a bit too valuable to keep in relation to its usage. I now have a cheaper EB3 with the same pickup as the EB2, its output being even more monstrous. 4. This one I felt kinda bad for because it involved a few injuries. Very minor ones, luckily. I didn't want to do it, but it came down to my job, so I complied. Here is the story. Years and years ago, back in the early 90s, I worked as a manager at a gas station. We had a great area supervisor who decided to retire. We were all very sad, and even more sad when her replacement came in. He was a total butt. He had just come out of retiring from the military and felt that with his military experience he could whip us into shape. One of the things he wanted done was make the stations look good, which I'm 100% for, but also do it with as little money as possible, which was fine if it was the right thing to do. This time, one of several, it wasn't. So around the pumps are these raised islands. The islands are painted on top with a special paint that has a good grit to it, so when it gets wet from rain or whatever, and people stand on them, they don't slip and fall. Well, this area supervisor wanted the island repainted, so he got some paint out of our supply depot and dropped it off at all the stations he ran. No problem. I went around myself and painted the sides of all the islands. They looked great, but the tops of them were not painted. So he shows up one day to inspect and sees that the tops aren't painted. Asks me why. I told him this isn't the right paint. It has to be the gritty thick paint because we don't want customers slipping and falling. He starts yelling at me, tells me he's going to fire me if they aren't repainted by the next day, blah blah blah, and says that it's not my responsibility to worry about the customers, it's his. Total egotistical mindset. Do as I say, don't think. So I did what he said. I repainted all the tops of the islands that day. Nice warm day in the fall, hadn't gotten wet yet really. Next days he shows up, looks around, and has this grin on his face like he beat me into submission type thing. Says something, "See, next time just do what I say, don't question my judgment." I just nodded, knowing what was about to come, and dreading it because I knew that the customer was going to be the victim here, but there was nothing I could do. A week later we get our first rain. Some of our islands stayed dry under the canopy, but about half of them got wet, because the rain was coming in somewhat sideways. And then it happens. Lady gets out of her car in nice shoes, with no grip, steps on the island, slips and falls. She's not really hurt, just a bit of her backside and back. But we call the ambulance anyway. She's pissed. I just tell her to bill the station and give her the address to make a claim against my area supervisor's info. Then it happens 3 more times over the next couple days. 2 of them were very minor, but the customers were also pissed. But didn't get an ambulance or go to the hospital, but they also got the contact information of my area manager. Then number 4 happened. Could have been much worse, but this guy was dressed in a super nice and apparently expensive suit. Slipped and fell with the hose in his hand right after taking it out of the car. He twisted his ankle, cue ambulance, and a few drops of gas got on his clothes. I again provide my area supervisor's info. Then the weather dries up, and the problem goes away for that week at least. About 10 days later, my supervisor drives into my station with his boss. I had met his boss a couple of times, cool guy, kind of one of those people that don't take BS from anybody, but is super down to earth and reasonable. Apparently, the nice suit guy was a lawyer. He has filed a suit against the station for medical bills, pain, and suffering, and the replacement of his super expensive suit. I don't know what the lawsuit was for, but it was way over 10 grand. So the area supervisor and his boss come up to me to discuss the situation. I told them that wasn't the only incident, as I had filed my paperwork as I was supposed to. There was a total of 4 while it was raining. The big boss asked me why this was all of a sudden a problem. I looked at the area supervisor, who I could tell on his face was hoping I was going to say something untrue, but nope. I'm going to tell it exactly how it was. I laid it all out. I told him what I was given. I told him that I didn't paint the tops originally, that I told the area supervisor that it wasn't the right paint. He told me to do it anyway or lose my job. I even told him that the area supervisor told me that customer safety wasn't my responsibility, it was his, which is why I gave everyone who got injured the area supervisor's information. The big boss asked me a couple of questions and turned to the area supervisor and says something like, "Okay, I have what I need. Let's go." And they left. Surprisingly, the area supervisor kept his job after that, but had it out for me. I quit a few months later with no notice for a better job. But he got a huge reaming. Not only that, but his expenses were huge that quarter. He ended up on the bottom of the list, rank-wise, of area supervisors for costs for the quarter. They ended up having to have crews go to all his stations, strip off the bad paint, and repaint all of the tops of the islands with thick, gritty paint. And it had to be done fast before the next rain came in, so huge expense. All he had to do was get me a can or 2 and the other stations of the gritty paint, and I would have gladly used it. But because he had an ego and thought he knew best, it cost the company and his area the settlement of the lawsuit, the other injury claim, and the cost of the crews to come out and repaint all the tops. I'm just glad the injuries were minor. 5. I work for a company that gets hired to do the grunt work at large concerts. Basically, we set the gig up in the morning and tear it back down at night. 2 things you need to know first that are relevant to this story. Firstly, this is a job that has the potential to be inherently dangerous. You're working with very heavy equipment, and sometimes at a decent height off the ground, so there is always a possibility that you'll either fall off of something and do some damage, or something will fall on you and do some damage. To give you an example, one load-in we were working, one of the trucks was packed from top to bottom, side to side and front to back with flight cases. This is dangerous since it gives the people unloading the truck no breathing space to unload. While trying to get the first case off the truck, one of my co-workers lost his balance and fell off the ramp. Luckily, I was standing in the perfect place to catch him and cushion his fall. If I hadn't been there, he'd have fallen just over 5 feet and landed flat on his back on solid concrete, which could have done serious damage to his back. So as you can imagine, health and safety is quite a big deal to our boss. We're required to wear a hard hat and steel toe-capped boots when we're working. And when we first apply for the job, we're given a sizable document on health and safety to read. And we go through a health and safety briefing before we start our first shift. Secondly, we start every shift by unloading trucks. Depending on the size of the show we're working, we have anywhere from 5 to 30 trucks to unload. Generally, we'll start unloading the trucks, and bit by bit, some of us will be called to start assembling freshly unloaded staging or rigging. This story involved the gentleman we'll call Kevin. Kevin was an older guy, maybe in his early 60s, and started working for the company at the same time I did. Although he worked similar jobs when he was my age in the late 70s and early 60s, Kevin was a perfectly affable guy, and it's always entertaining hearing about his experiences from working back in the day. However, Kevin is a little bit lax when it comes to health and safety. He's compliant to most of our guidelines, but some things he's a little bit less compliant with. The one thing he does that annoys everyone is sending down flight cases without checking that someone is on the ramp to take the case from him. A little bit of flight case etiquette. When you send a smallish flight case down a ramp, one that one person can wheel along the floor to its destination, you make sure there's one person on the ramp to grab the case and make sure it doesn't speed down the ramp and go flying into the middle of the arena floor. And at least one person on each side to guide the case down the ramp. These cases might be light enough that one person can wheel one across the floor solo, but they're heavy enough that it's gonna hurt if a runaway hits your leg. Kevin doesn't do this with the smaller cases, and this annoys everyone else. We've told him several times, but it goes in one ear and out the other. One particular show, we had 10 trucks to unload, and by the time we were on truck number 9, everyone, bar myself, Kevin, and a few others, had been allocated a job setting up a part of the show. The last truck was late, it had broken down en route to the venue. After we were finished with truck number 9, we were allowed to take a smoke break while we waited for the last truck to arrive. We confronted Kevin outside and he told us,
"Stop telling me how to do my job, I know what I'm doing."
So we all nodded and went to smoke our cigarettes. The final truck arrived not long after, and we went to go out and gut it. We opened the trailer doors, put the ramp in place, and Kevin and another co-worker got on the truck and started to unload the cases. Our boss John walked over to our truck and one of us said, "Hey John, would you mind helping us unload? We're a man down." John obliged, and we walked up to the ramp to get the first case. Just as he stepped foot on the ramp, Kevin launched his first middle. John caught the case and told Kevin to go with him for a chat. I jumped on the truck and took Kevin's place. We got to the truck in about 20 minutes. Then we were delegated to setting up the drum risers for the stage that we just unloaded. Kevin came back to join us, and we heard later that John had given Kevin a warning, and if he was ever caught breaking health and safety rules again, he'd be fired. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge is Ice Cream, number 82. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. If you enjoyed the video, then please do boop the like button, leave a comment, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe. Where are we? What day is this? This is for Thursday. Okay. I don't know if it's the heat that's making my brain go funny, but I was thinking earlier I should join some dating apps again, because that's always a good idea. I mean, there isn't really any point because I'm so picky. Because, someone that doesn't have pets, doesn't want kids, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, and although I don't care if other people do weed, I wouldn't want to live with it, so, I'm not going to date anyone that does. And that's before we get into personality, political beliefs, and various other stuff. Well. I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.